I originally got into the area because of, well, it actually was just supposed to be a chapter of my dissertation. I was going to talk about a range of different issues in philosophy of cognitive science, and I was going to do some stuff in memory first. And then I just got stuck there and told my advisor at the time that I had a problem, that my first chapter was now like 130 pages long. And he was like, well, that's not a problem. That's a dissertation. Like, you're actually, that's your dissertation. I'm like, oh, okay. So then that became the focus of my project. And at the time, what I was really interested in was the difference between the way that philosophers talked about memory and the way that for the large majority of memory scientists, the way that they talked about memory. So most of the conversations about memory in philosophy weren't happening amongst philosophers of cognitive science. You saw it mostly amongst epistemologists, people interested in questions about personal identity, a little bit in ethics, people who really thought about memory in this preservative, hold on to representations for a long time sort of way. So in epistemology, it's a fairly automatic sentence defined. If you're going to mention memory in an article in epistemology, they almost always say, and memory just is stored knowledge, and then go on to say whatever it is they're going to say about that kind of idea. And then if you look at the cognitive science of memory, it just shows us that all over the place, memory is a mess. We constantly think we're remembering when we're not. We're easily susceptible to all kinds of memory errors. And I thought it was just interesting that those two projects didn't fit together very well. There were a set of papers coming out of the Tanagawa laboratory at MIT that were getting a lot of press for the ability to use optogenetics, which I talk about in the paper for today, to create what looked like a rat model of false memory, which was really exciting for a number of reasons. One, well, I think in part because most of the sort of theorizing about how to make sense of the fact that false memory happens all over the time for us, for humans, there weren't a lot of great mechanistic accounts of what might be going on to sort of make that the case, in part because in other areas of science, when we see something happening in the case of humans, one way of trying to triangulate on what the mechanisms might be is to look at animal models of those sorts of things. But it's not really clear what animal models of false memory would look like, or at least that's what it seemed like until these studies started actually pursuing that kind of idea. Having started as someone who was fascinated by the cognitive literature on false memory and is now thinking about engram detection and manipulation and the sort of cellular processes of memory, I'm interested in sort of how all of these projects about memory across the various sciences fit together. Because if you spend a lot of time reading the science on one end of the spectrum or the other, you get a very different impression of how people think about the importance of something like a memory trace or an engram or a representation for explaining how it is that memory works. But if you come from philosophy of cognitive science, when you were introduced to cognitive science, you get this picture of the sciences as a set of levels that all hang together really neatly. And in some cognitive science textbooks, you even get memory as the example of how that happens. So you have human experiments, people like HM, where we knew that something was wrong with his hippocampus, and that had to do with his inability to retain memories over time. And then we had, lessons about how long-term potentiation worked, and that especially happened in the hippocampus. And oh, look, there's one beautiful story about how it all can kind of hang together. And it seems like in reading and talking with scientists in different aspects, it's less clear that everyone is sort of on the same page about that kind of a picture. So as a philosopher who looks at what science is doing, that's a really interesting place. So I'm going to probably keep writing about memory for even longer. In this paper, it was originally part of a symposium that Jackie Sullivan, who's also a professor here, was a part of at a Philosophy of Science Association meeting, where we were exploring optogenetics in particular as an exciting new technique that was being used throughout neuroscience, and asking a lot of questions about whether and how and in what ways it was sort of revolutionizing the way that neuroscience was being done. And I was and continue to be particularly interested in the ways that it's allowed us to ask new questions and answer questions differently about how memory is working. So I've been especially excited about the ways in which it allows, more broadly than just the question about false memory, what it allows for animal models of memory is that by being able to use optogenetics to tag the engrams or the trace of the past experience that's happened, you now have the ability to turn the memory on and off or activate the process of retrieval outside of the original context, which has been a sort of limitation on a lot of animal studies of memory for a long time. The only way to get retrieval to happen is to put the animal back in context, right? If I want you to remember something, I can just bring that up to you and get you to initiate that. I don't have to take you back to your childhood home to get you to have memories of that experience. But in animal models, that's been a lot more difficult to do because there isn't, I just have to take them right back. And so now having the ability to directly activate, or at least activate outside of context, those memories, that opens up a range of ways to study and manipulate those memories that weren't previously possible. For the most part, when cognitive psychologists talk about this, they use the term false memory as a kind of blanket for any time in which I think I'm remembering and my memory isn't accurate. But of course, it can be inaccurate in many respects. And I think that there's an important distinction between the ones where what I've done is sort of distort the information that I had retained in some respects versus really confabulate. So there are instances, sometimes in psychiatric conditions, also in everyday situations, where you can have a sort of full-blown memory that isn't accurate. So for the philosophers in the room, the distinction between illusion and hallucination and perception that gets a lot more attention, I think that you can make a similar distinction between misremembering and confabulation and memory along those kinds of lines. Methodologically, how you tease those apart is really tricky, right? Because the only way I can know what's in there is by what comes out, right? Living in Kansas, my go-to example of this is when you're driving down the highway. So Kansas, for those of you that don't know, is very, very flat for most of the state. And if you're driving, you easily be prone to zoning out. And some song might come on the radio that you haven't heard, and you still listen to the radio in like 25 years. And all of a sudden you discover you know all the lyrics to that song, right? Like outside of that experience, you'd have no idea that memory was sort of in there in some way, right? So you don't know what's there until you activate retrieval, but you want to have some sense of like, well, it had to have been there in some respect prior to this in order to sort of, it's a rule you only know by finding its exceptions in some way. So we think that there's this difference, but we can't really tease these things apart. So the only way to what's stored is by this retrieval process, but we want to ask questions directly about this thing that's stored. And optogenetics looks like it gives you a way, because it gives you a way of tagging, by tagging the cells that are involved in the initial experience. Now I don't have to put the animal back in its context or ask them to retrieve it. I just sort of turn it back on to see if I shine light on it and see if that reactivates the state. So it's sort of giving us a new sort of arrow in the manipulation of that system. How different that arrow is than the standard retrieval arrow, I think that's an open and really interesting question, but it just gives you sort of finer control. So it lets you see certain things you couldn't have seen previously. So different than us, but when an animal can't, so you train an animal to do something and you know that certain interventions will keep them from being able to reinstate the memory. So you know that if they learn how to do a particular thing, but then you give them a particular kind of protein synthesis inhibitor, they won't hold on to that memory. It will just go away. And so, but then you might wonder, well, like, did the memory really go away, or can they just not get to it now? And it's difficult to sort between those two alternatives. In a normal context, if you gave a person a decent set of those, of a list of semantically related words, 10 to 15 words that are semantically related, and you give them a recognition test later where that list is made up of things that were definitely not on the list, unrelated, like apple, things that were definitely on the list, like pillow, and then words that were related but not on the list, like sleep. The vast majority of people, something like 60 to 70% of people in a standard context will remember that word was there, and they won't just say oh, I think I heard it, but they'll remember it as well as some of the best remembered words on the original list. And if you put them in certain contexts where you're reading the words in different voices, they'll say yeah, I remember the voice that word was said in, or they'll even say oh no, I know it was on the list because when that word came on, it made me think about, all right, and so they'll give you these kinds of explanations. An incredibly robust effect. It's now sort of like the Stroop test. It's a kind of thing that you test other effects by showing whether you got this effect first as a kind of legitimacy of whatever intervention you're doing. It's an incredibly robust finding. So it's kind of example of a case where, so when you say that sleep was on the list and it wasn't, it's a false memory, at least in some respect, because what you're remembering is not true. It wasn't on the list, but it's the kind of ones that make me think of a really important distinction between these kind of misrememberings and and confabulations, because it's the kind of error you couldn't make unless you retained the list in question, right? So there's a reason why you think that word was on the list and not apple, and it's because it's related to, so, it has all of the markings of a psychological effect that gets philosophers interested, right? Because like you're wrong, but you couldn't get it wrong unless you were right. Like unless you knew what you were doing, you couldn't make the mistake, and that's puzzling. And so those are it's a standard paradigm. So that's the one I was thinking of primarily. And I mean, what caught my eye in the Tanagawa, I don't remember what the order of authors is on that 2013 paper, but on that paper out of their lab, was that, and they cite the Bies, Rediger, and McDermott things as an inspiration for what it is that they're doing. So in those cases, I think about those as instances where you have a memory and then you get some of the details wrong over time. So thinking that sleep was on the list is a way of sort of distorting the initial memory that you had, or your memory for the past event. I think that there are ways in which, when we think about cognition more broadly, there are ways in which memory is really unlike the rest of it, in ways that we should pay more attention to. So I think that, and this has come from, like, as I try to think more and more about why you might think that you need a memory trace, or when are the arguments for those things on their best sort of footing, it seems like, well, it's because we have, at least sometimes, the kind of argument I've been trying to make lately is, at least sometimes it looks like we manage to retain information from particular past events, despite the fact that everything about the design of our cognitive architecture doesn't lead us in that, it's not the most recent, it's not the most frequent, it's not the most just consistent, it doesn't have the kind of, like, there's no general explanation for why we would hold on to this, except that we just, for some reason, have this particular, my 7th birthday is just, it's just funny because I don't actually remember my 7th birthday, but that's always my example. But people have different ones of these that you do remember, and they just sort of stick there. And why is that the case? So, it seems like holding on to that kind of particular information, and if certain theories are right, doing that with a whole lot of detail and feeling as if that happened to you, do you think that those things are important? That seems really unlike a lot of the other things that we do. And so it doesn't fit well into a lot of kind of general models of how the mind works. I think there is still some space for at least theoretical questions. I don't know whether I don't care whether they belong to philosophers or they belong to scientists. I think they're just questions that aren't directly empirical, like questions about, like, well, what do you think it takes for the memory trace to be the same memory trace over time? That puzzle I was just talking about. I think when you design an experiment, you have an idea of what you're looking for in mind. That's part of what sets up, which sorts of controls you're doing, because that's what you think you're tracking over time. So I think those kinds of questions about what it takes for something to count as a memory, or how much accuracy is really required for a memory to be accurate, those questions aren't going to be empirical questions, or at least not exclusively. I think empirical work is going to inform and shape them, but there's still space to ask those kind of broader conceptual style questions about a lot of phenomena, not just about memory, but those are the ones that I've been focused on. The idea of reconstruction as meaning, like, you have to start from scratch, like the materials with which you do the constructing are no longer there. Like, you've got to be like, well, you asked me about my 7th birthday, and I just start from, like, well, birthdays have cake, and when I was 7, I lived here, and all I'm doing is bringing in general things without anything from that particular past event. It's true that for a lot of things, I could converge on the right, I could generate a representation that manages to match. But there are at least some things where it looks like I can generate an accurate representation, where it's hard to explain how, other than sheer luck, I managed to do that. And then it looks like, why not just say, like, yeah, at least in some cases, at least sometimes that thing is there. So sometimes I think people talk about construction in both ways. And I don't know why somebody who was a tracer engram fan or proponent couldn't allow the first form. So of course, you might have to do some rebuilding at retrieval or at remembering in order to do something, without thinking that means there's nothing stored or something like that. So
from that perspective, it's not such a categorical distinction for you? Or?
I guess the categorical distinction would be, I think it's a finer distinction, or at least it looks like it could involve making the trace view more extreme than it has to be. If you thought that any reconstructive process would rule out something being stored. I guess it's only a principal distinction for the people who think that really those reconstructive processes can explain everything. It looks like they're, I mean, as Moscovich and Nadel do, you sort of put the pressure on them by giving examples of cases where it looks really hard to explain without there being something